So if you're in no contact with a dismissive avoidant, then you may be wondering what the signs are when they want to get back together. For many people, they realize that sometimes dismissive avoidants aren't very direct when it comes to communicating about their intentions. Generally speaking, avoidants will use indirect methods to initiate contact with you first. And unlike anxious attachers, they won't just immediately come out and be direct with their thoughts and feelings because they essentially haven't been programmed to operate that way. As a result, they will probably beat around the bush, maybe just pop in casually at first, and they're really just trying to test the waters to see if it's even safe and if you're ultimately available to reconnect. If you're new to my content, then my name is Charlie, and welcome to my channel where I talk about all things attachment theory and no contact. Now, before I go into these signs that an avoidant wants to reconnect with you, I want to just define what reconnection can mean. Just because somebody wants to reconnect with you doesn't mean they always want to do it emotionally. And it doesn't always mean that reconnection will lead to a relationship again. So take all of that into consideration as you're hearing all of these signs, because it truly is not my intention to give anyone false hope. And it truly isn't my desire to set people up for failure. And just because an avoidant is coming back doesn't necessarily mean it's always the best thing for you. I'll cover that in more detail near the end. So, sign number one that an avoidant X may be interested in reconnecting with you. The first sign an avoidant may be interested in reconnecting with you is you start to see them pop up on social media again. This could be as simple as unblocking you and re-adding you if that's what happened during the breakup, or if they didn't do that, then they could start to crop up in your stories again. For anyone that doesn't use Instagram, you can actually see who views your stories, and sometimes avoidants will use this as an indirect way to make it known that they're looking into you, that they are curious about you. And they're of course not dumb, they're not naive that it shows that they view your stories. For many avoidants, this is actually the intention. They want to intentionally leave a trace that they were viewing your stories because they may not feel safe yet necessarily liking your posts, commenting on any pictures and videos, or perhaps just directly DMing you. Now, this sign on its own isn't always a clear indication that they want to reconnect with you. Sometimes it's possibly just because they're missing you. And it can be really difficult for you to know if that's the case unless they come out and say it, but chances are somebody wouldn't view your stories after they've broken up with you unless they genuinely still kind of like you and they possibly see that option of reconnection at some point in the future. Generally speaking, when an avoidant is completely done with someone, they're probably not going to look at your stories. And just because they're looking at your stories doesn't mean they necessarily want to reconnect with you romantically. It could just simply mean that they're curious about you and they're wondering what you've been up to. But it may also be because it's kind of like the first step in them gauging as to whether or not they should initiate contact with you. Believe it or not, many avoidants don't necessarily want to always come back if you have a new partner, and they don't always want to try coming back if they think that you would be worse off. There's kind of a belief in the attachment theory community that avoidants and fearful avoidants are just emotionally stunted, which is entirely untrue. Many of them are very emotionally aware, and in my sessions working with avoidants, they have told me that for reasons they haven't reconnected with an ex is simply because they don't want to go back and make their life any worse. Partly this is because they acknowledge the ways in which they showed up and also disconnected from that relationship, but also because it stems from a limiting self-belief about themselves. They feel as though perhaps they're not good enough to win someone back again, and that there would be no reason for this person to take them back because they're not worthy of love after what's happened. And for many anxious attachers, it can be really difficult to rationalize this because, again, avoidants aren't always going to share this out in the open. This is a deeply vulnerable thing to think about yourself, but also even more vulnerable to share with someone else. So just because an avoidant isn't necessarily sharing their feelings and emotions with you doesn't mean they're not having them. Now, this sign on its own doesn't necessarily mean anything special. They may just be reminiscent or nostalgic about the relationship they had with you. They may miss you as a person, but when you couple this sign with sign number 2, then then it could be an indication that they are working toward taking more direct communication with you. So sign number 2 is when they reach out to you directly. This, again, isn't always direct in the sense how an anxious attacher would reach out to someone directly and just maybe share what's on their mind or ask them outright to catch up. Sometimes for avoidance, when they reach out to you directly, it is probably going to be very casual at first. It's going to be from an arm's length distance, of course, because they don't want to create conflict. They don't want to feel pain, but they also don't want to cause the other person pain. And it's really important to consider that. This may take the form of them sending you a meme or tagging you in one. They may also continue to like your posts even more, or they may even start commenting on your posts. The other aspect is they may also reach out to you directly via direct message if some time has passed and those other signs have been there. So keep in mind that just because they're doing this doesn't mean they're going to come out and share their feelings with you right away. They are the type to kind of ease into that kind of conversation. And so they're probably going to test the waters, keep the conversation light, and just maybe see what you've been up to. They might just catch up and maybe share about what's been going on in their life. And if that conversation progresses organically and it feels good for both people, then you might find that they start to share a little bit about their feelings and maybe some of their reasons for reaching out to you again. This doesn't necessarily mean that they want to get back into a relationship with you, so don't look into it too much. I myself, who have dated avoidants, but also is a healing fearful avoidant, have seen in the past where exes came back to me, and because I was more anxious at the time, I thought that they wanted to get back together. But on the contrary, they left just as quickly as they came back. So don't get married to the idea that this means they want to get back together with you. There should actually be a lot more before you start to have those kind of thoughts. So if you lean more anxiously attached and you are seeing these signs, try not to get too attached to the outcome too soon if you do want them back. And so moving on over to sign number 3, when this conversation is perceived to be going well for the avoidant and the anxious attacher, if they're reciprocating in the conversation, then that is where they may actually outright ask you to catch up in person or to have a phone call or FaceTime. And this is ultimately what many anxious attachers who want to get back together with their avoidant ex are probably hoping for, because it's usually a promising sign that they want to have some prolonged interaction with you. Now, if an avoidant comes back and they don't necessarily ask you directly to catch up, that doesn't mean they don't necessarily want to. It just may mean that they may have fears of rejection. So keep that in mind, that sometimes some avoidants need to have their hand held a little bit. Sometimes people just need a little bit of a gentle push. So if your avoidant ex is coming back and they're like messaging you consistently, but they haven't necessarily gotten to the point of why they're interacting with you again, then maybe just give them a nudge if that's what you're looking for. However, if they do take the initiative to ask you to meet up, then you're probably going to find that their enthusiasm about interacting with you will have a more positive spin on things. And that's where you'll find that their responses to your messages will speed up once again, especially if they were maybe a little bit more flaky and inconsistent with responding to your messages. Again, avoidants operate through their feelings and their fears, and when their fears become too much, they start to pull away. It's when they pull away that they're able to understand their emotions and the situation a little bit clearer, and that's when their feelings around the situation can become more powerful, which ultimately allows them to take action. And so I'm not saying that them taking space is necessary and always healthy, but sometimes it can be helpful for relationships to let people see what's most important. And I know it's painful for anxious attachers to go through, but if you're getting positive reinforcement from an avoidant at this point, and this is what you're looking for, then I would just recommend, take things casual, be really slow about things, and intentional. Don't try to push things too fast, because you don't want to indirectly fall into old patterns or habits that maybe dominated the relationship last time and may have caused them to fail. Chances are at this stage, if an avoidant is being proactive with messaging you and responding to you, and they're being proactive with planning dates, then they're obviously trying to build up to something more. And they may feel more comfortable talking about the relationship and everything that they've worked on during this time, if they have, when they're with you in person. So try to not rush those conversations before catching up. Sometimes having those conversations in person can actually be better than over text message, because when you're on text message, you don't always get what the person is saying accurately. You don't pick up on their tone of voice. You don't get the inflection in their voice. And it's just not a quality form of communication when trying to repair a disconnection. So I would wholeheartedly recommend that if an avoidant is coming back and they've said they want to catch up and have a conversation in person, then if that's what you want, then by all means, set up that date and maybe just catch up. But keep it casual, keep it light. Try not to talk too much about the negatives, unless, of course, something seriously happened. But at this stage, I wouldn't really be talking about getting back together just yet. There's a lot more you have to discuss before you start having that conversation. Which leads me into the fourth sign. And by this point, they've probably asked you to meet up and have a conversation in person. Keep in mind that this conversation probably won't fix all of the problems from the last relationship, but it's a good positive start, especially if it goes well. Chances are it will go well if not much resentment has been built up during your time apart, and people in the conversation are doing a good job of managing their emotions, because sometimes these conversations can go south very quickly, especially if people have built up a lot of resentment. So it's important to kind of keep this reconnection kind of light, really casual, and do it maybe someplace public, maybe at a coffee shop or a restaurant, wherever you feel more comfortable doing it. And it doesn't hurt to maybe do it at some place where you both used to hang out quite a bit. Chances are you have some positive memories associated with that place, which only reinforces the positive nature of that meetup. Of course, there's going to be some tense moments. There may be some uncomfortable conversations within it, but it doesn't mean you can't start talking about the serious issues on a smaller scale and continue to, from this point, see each other even more. As I said already, it's really important to take things slow and to take things one meetup at a time. Just because they are wanting to meet up with you and talk about things doesn't mean that you can't disconnect and say, you know what, it's not for me. It also doesn't mean that they can't do that. So again, don't get married to the outcome. Focus more on the journey and all of the effort it takes to get there. We can often lose sight of the work and the things that we need to do before we get to that outcome, which could be, in this case, getting back together with your avoidant ex, that we often forget about some of our needs and things we need to communicate before we get back into that relationship. So again, it's really important to know what is important to discuss during these times, but to still keep it light. You can think of it as like reconnecting, but going on dates again for the first time. And this is often made easier if no contact has been a little bit longer, can be over a year. But I would find that if it's only been a few months, then chances are not much has happened during that time. Both people probably haven't changed that much, and there's probably still a lot of pain associated with that last relationship. So it doesn't hurt both sides to take more time and no contact to figure out what you both really want, maybe what both worked in the last relationship and what wasn't working, and how you both can have that conversation in a mature way without letting your emotions get the better of you when you do have that conversation. Having open, honest, and concise communication during that time will go a long way, because chances are if you feel like your avoidant hasn't really worked on themselves and that's something that bothers you when they reconnect, that may trigger trigger you, which can only make them pull away. And that isn't to point blame at any one side or the other, but it just goes to show how the nuance in the conversation can really feed into negativity. And that's why it's really important to do as much as you can to make the conversation as positive as possible. So say, for example, you're at a point where all four of these signs are present, and maybe you have a meetup planned with your avoidant ex, and you're kind of unsure of how the conversation is going to go. Well, I've kind of sprinkled in some bits of information on how to approach that conversation, but there are a few things you can consider to maybe have a better outcome at the end of the day. So keep in mind that it's really important to be intentional about the pacing at which you both reconnect. And if there are any deal breakers about the last relationship and maybe about how you both disconnected, it's really important to bring that up at the right time and place. It doesn't mean you bring it up in that initial conversation when you're both just catching up, but if you're both at the point where you're talking about dating again and getting back together, then it's really important to discuss about what the last relationship was like, what worked and what didn't, maybe what you did right, but also what you did wrong and what they did right and wrong. It's really important to focus on not just the things that they did wrong or what you did wrong, but how each side did things right. Because obviously, if you're trying to reconnect, it's important to acknowledge where people were actually good, because it not only validates them, it also reassures both parties that getting back together might not be as bad as you might think. And when you hyper-focus on just the negative qualities of the relationship and why it wasn't working, you can kind of go into it with those fears kind of still intact. You can kind of think that it's going to happen again, but when you have that neutral outlook and you understand that they do things right, but they sometimes do things wrong, you can kind of look at them from a balanced perspective and know where you have to work, but also understand where you can both improve upon. The other thing I like to reiterate is that it's important for both parties to get clear on what reconnection would look like. Again, it's really important to not go back to the same type of relationship. You don't want to fall into bad negative habits and patterns because you're probably just going to have a repeat of last time. So that's why it's really important to discuss what a new relationship could look like. Doesn't necessarily mean everything is new, but in terms of maybe some of the negative things that transpired between you two, it's really important to consider how you both could handle that differently. One of the obvious examples is how couples manage conflict. Many of them can often fail to turn conflict into connection, and so learning certain strategies that work for both of you to take conflict and turn it into a connection and reassure each other during that time can go a long way for a relationship that's coming back together. Another important aspect is to acknowledge the elephant in the room. It is important to acknowledge that the relationship has also broken up already, and it's also important to acknowledge ways in which it was handled properly, but also where it wasn't. And on top of that, it's also important to discuss that if you are getting back together, how you would both handle disconnection or breaking up differently the next time. I think it's a very mature conversation to have, and it's very realistic to consider because it is naive to think that people will be in your life forever. It's naive to think that just because someone has left once and they're saying all of these great things about how much they miss you, that they won't leave again. So to set yourselves both up for success by having a realistic and adult conversation of what another separation could look like, think of it as like a prenup. How would you both treat each other when you break up the next time, if it happens again? It doesn't mean it will happen. It just means you can both keep each other accountable and understand how to proceed when that conversation comes up, if it does. The last thing to consider is to establish new boundaries or reestablishing old boundaries that weren't respected in the last relationship. Just because you've dated already and you've stated those boundaries in the past doesn't mean they can't be restated. Again, think of this as like getting into a new contract. You have to restate all the ins and outs. You have to dot all of the I's and cross all of your T's again. And so it's really important to restate your deal breakers, your boundaries, but also other things like ways in which your partner can make you feel safe and how you can support them when they may be shutting down, or recognizing when you both need to take time apart from a difficult conversation that just really isn't going anywhere. And it's also important to consider the possibility of couples therapy or maybe some peer support if the relationship isn't working again. The more you do this, and the sooner you do it during the discussion of getting back together, the more likely you are to develop open and honest conversation and communication very early on. It's one thing to have good intentions about getting back together and being so caught up in the emotions of being chosen again, but it's another thing entirely to do all of that with intention. And when you do this with intention, you not only hold yourself accountable to the other person, but you also hold yourself accountable, because there's no confusion anymore. There is no mystery as to how someone should behave or not behave, because you've gotten that out in the open before you've agreed to get back together. So those are the best pieces of advice I would recommend to anybody that's considering getting back together with their avoidant ex. I myself, who is a fearful avoidant, but mainly secure now, had these same conversations when I started to get back together with my fearful avoidant ex. I will say that because we had these conversations, now in the relationship, our communication is healthier, it's more mature, but it's also more empathetic, which wasn't always present in the last relationship. And so by doing this, we've actually fostered a more secure and adult form of connection and love that still challenges us, but also helps us to acknowledge personally where we kind of mess up. And in the past, that was a challenge. So if that sounds like what your last relationship was like, maybe give some of these tips a try throughout the process of you and your ex getting back together. By doing this and being intentional with the pacing, you'll be able to sort of figure out if they're that serious about you, and if they're really just interested in a short-term hookup. Because chances are anybody that just wants a quick booty call, they're not going to put in all of this effort. They're not going to take the time to have these conversations. And if they do, they're probably going to get really frustrated, shut down, and not treat you with the respect you deserve before you both start dating again. So don't be so quick to take anyone back, not even just an avoidant, any attachment style. And be sure to do it with intention, delicacy, and care, because it's a really important thing to consider. This is both your emotional and mental health on the line, and chances are you've already known how that last person had both a negative and positive effect on those factors. So keep that in mind. Remain as neutral as possible, but still be optimistic. That's the best advice I could share. And for those that may be in no contact with an avoidant right now and haven't had a chance to reconnect with them, this is a great opportunity to reflect on all of these things in case it does happen again. Chances are, if they do come back, you'll have this conversation anyways, so it doesn't hurt to already have some of this thought about before that actually happens. You don't necessarily want to get caught off guard and maybe fall prey to your own emotions at that time. It can go a long way to kind of think about this stuff ahead of time. Also, if you're interested in learning more about what an avoidant feels during no contact and when they are most likely to reach out to you, then feel free to check out my video on that there. In the meantime, happy healing, and I will see you in the next video.